advances in genetic science in his new novel, Next. Now on Book TV, the best-selling author of Jurassic Park details his belief of how gene manipulation can help cure drug addiction. This is an hour.
Good evening. Welcome to the National Press Club, where we're presenting Michael Crichton and his new novel, Next. My name is Carol Sargent. I'm a literary specialist at Georgetown University, and I'm the club's representative from its book committee. You'll be able to buy books outside, I think, until about 7 o'clock. So if you haven't gotten your book yet, you can, you would be able to slip out and go ahead and purchase your book. Before I introduce our author and invite him to take the podium, much as he did at the National Press Club back in 1993, when he predicted that the mass media would be gone in a decade, oops. I've been teasing him about that. I'm going to ask you, as his fans, to extend him some techno-fan courtesies this evening by turning off your cell phones and your pagers. Thank you for doing that. Also, take a look at the little question card. You're going to see a little card on your seat. And I want you to think about what you'd like to ask Michael Crichton. I encourage you to think richly. Although it's a valid question to ask, where do you get your ideas, it would also be interesting to push beyond that, to see if there's something that you really are curious about in terms of how he impacts your life. Pass the cards to either Eleanor Herman or Joe Motherall, who will be in the audience and circulating around as you write your questions. Michael Crichton's book of the moment, as you know, is Next. It dropped, as they say in publishing, today. So today, the 28th of November, the book is published. It's a gripping novel where he posits that the future may already be happening to us, and it's closer than we think. I'm actually going to let him tell you about it, but I encourage you to buy it, and he doesn't necessarily need the money, but a portion of the proceeds tonight will go to support the National Press Club's nonprofit Eric Friedheim Library, and that's instrumental in bringing you great events like this, so know that your money is also going to a nonprofit cause. Next is an exciting book, but if you ask me for one reason, if you were going to say, Carol, why did you want to come up and introduce him tonight? It's got to be Westworld. That 1973 science fiction movie starring Yul Brynner, Richard Benjamin, and James Brolin. Come on, you didn't think I was going to go for the obvious stuff, did you? He wrote it, he directed it, and I was jaw-dropped. It looked seamless, like flawless magic. The typical hat-in-hand writer in my mind then was someone who had to beg Hollywood to produce a script. Crichton imparted a sense that writers were powerful and that they could do anything. They didn't have to sit helplessly by while directors mangled their novels. They could direct their own. They could earn medical degrees from Harvard. They could win Emmys, plus Writers Guild of America and Peabody Awards. That was all for ER. They could be visiting writers at MIT, of all places. They could champion all authors through work with the Authors Guild. Writers could even be named among the 50 most beautiful people by People magazine. Yeah. Now that, to me, was inspiration. Michael Crichton has also won about 1,000 other awards, including, and this is a fun one, he's had an actual dinosaur named after him. But if I named all the awards, we'd be here all night. Let's just say he's well-rounded. So for your delectation, now back at the National Press Club, I bring you assembled guests, Dr. Michael Crichton.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Carol. That was very nice. I once worked on a robot movie where every time a taxi drove by in the street outside, the robot would turn and smash into the wall. We eventually had to put them all on wires and hide the wires. I don't know why I told you that. The last time I was here, I talked about global warming, and it was a very much misunderstood discussion, so I'll try and be a little more careful this time. But I think sometimes misunderstandings are inevitable. I'm reminded of the story about the man who went on vacation and had his best friend look after his cat. And while he was on the beach in Saint-Tropez, his friend called up and said, "I have some news for you." He said, "Your cat got up on the roof Then from the roof, it jumped to the tree. We called the fire department. The fire department went up in the tree, but the cat fell and died. And the man said, I can't believe you would tell me in this way. What are you doing? And he said, well, what am I supposed to do? He said, you have to prepare me. He said, on the first day, you call me and you say, the cat's on the roof and we can't get it down. Then the second day, you call me and say, the cat jumped from the roof to the tree and we call the fire department. Then on the third day, when you tell me, I'm prepared. And the guy says, okay, that's how you want it? He says, yes, that's how I want it. A few days later, his friend calls again and said, listen, your mother's up on the roof and we can't get her down. Misunderstanding. Recently, we've heard complaints that the government is twisting science for political advantage, distorting and suppressing facts, censoring published reports so that they confirm and conform to government policies. Individual scientists are saying that their research is being misrepresented. Others are prevented from speaking. However, these complaints are coming from England, where the Blair government is under fire for a wide range of scientific missteps. We have, of course, heard the same complaints about the American government. From time to time, similar complaints are heard from France, Germany, and elsewhere. What's going on? One possible answer is that we're seeing information warfare at work. In an information age, conflict is naturally dealt with by firing off press releases, concocting media events, misrepresenting the legitimate concerns of opponents, or simply trashing their reputations. That's how the game is played. And that's how, arguably, decisions are arrived at the present time. The winner is whoever has the most lobbying money, the loudest voice, the fastest press releases, the biggest moral posture. The decision-making process has nothing to do with science. It has to do with warfare. And as they say of wars, truth is the first casualty. Certainly we are today astonishingly tolerant of untruths. Advocates for causes, including scientists, openly admit that they exaggerate their claims or stand by silently while the media does it for them. We all know the media is unapologetically erroneous to the point of fraud. It's the pressure of deadlines, you see. No time to check the facts. We have to go with the story that we hear. And that's why we said the miners weren't dead when they really were. And that's why the reporter for the Times-Picayune said that he saw bodies stacked in the Superdome in New Orleans when he really didn't. Later, he explained he was reporting what he'd been told. But he wrote it as if he himself had seen it to make it a better story, which it certainly was. It added a whole layer of believability to the fiction. But that's not a lie. That's just a technical error. What was wrong was the original rumor. Well, give that man a Pulitzer, and so they did. Why do we as a society tolerate this? In a world where news is entertainment, we are relaxed about facts. It does seem reasonable to focus on what Katie Couric is wearing. The BBC reports that blondes will become extinct based on nothing whatsoever. Hey, it's a good story. They also report that in 1,000 years, men will have bigger penises and women will have pert breasts. This, at least, is based on the claim of someone at the London School of Economics. And the story is much too good to question, let alone refuse to run, simply because it's obviously fiction. Any story about what will happen in 1,000 years is by definition fiction, whether it's the growth of pert breasts or the shrinkage of Greenland glaciers. It's fiction. But we're fed such stories daily. Now I want to pause here for a moment of sort of factual clarification, a reality check. Let's be clear. Nobody can predict the future. I claim nobody can predict the future even 24 hours from now. I don't know why I'm even going over this ground with sensible people, but it seems to be necessary. Let's review some evidence, large and small. First, large. The biggest geopolitical event of the last 50 years was the collapse of the former Soviet Union. and the end of the Cold War. That collapse began with the fall, or visibly began, with the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989. If you go back and look at newspapers and TV reports for the week prior, you will find absolutely no indication that anybody knew the wall was going to fall. Nobody knew. There were, of course, vague reports that the Soviet Union was weaker than we'd previously thought. But nobody predicted catastrophic collapse. The biggest geopolitical event of my life arrived unexpectedly. I'll give you a small example. In my business, studios spend a lot of money to predict how their movies will do. It's vitally important because advertising budgets are on the order of tens of millions of dollars. So studios are engaged in focused, short-term predictions. In the last week, studios are measuring the interest of a defined audience that they've already interacted with in a variety of ways. They've tested how audiences respond in advance to their screenings. They've tested their ads. They've tracked audience interest for months. And they have spent millions to attract audiences and to present the movie in a way that hides its weaknesses and emphasizes its strengths. So studios have a tremendous amount of advance information with which to predict the future 1 week away. They have lots of experience doing this because every weekend there's another movie and they're trying to predict how much advertising money to put in on a Thursday. So how do they do? Fact, 1 week in advance, nobody can know a movie's opening gross within 20%. On the contrary, there are constant surprises. Fact, 1 week in advance, no one can know a movie's final gross within 50%. The estimates of final gross become more accurate as the weeks go on. After 2 or 3 weeks, the estimates are pretty good. But that's not predicting the future. That's extending a trend line. Since prediction is impossible, any stated prediction of the future is simply a lie to sell a position. If you claim to know what's going to happen in 2040 or 2100 or the year 3000, you're at best self-deluded. You're claiming to do what no one can do. Now, with that little diversion, let's return to how information is used in modern society and some of the challenges that it presents to science. And let's begin by agreeing that information has always been manipulated for advantage. It's as old as the Trojan horse. Benjamin Franklin was a master at disinformation. Thomas Jefferson ran a bitterly negative presidential campaign. It worked then as it works now. People have always lied to draw an audience or to get new money. None of this is exactly new. Yet I believe we have entered an era where information has new meaning and new social significance. I'm particularly interested in the scientific disputes that we now see. And if you stop and think for a moment, you realize that we're overrun with these disputes. Cell phones and cancer, cell phones and driving, cancer and power lines, Vioxx and Celebrex, global warming, antioxidants, high fiber, breast implants, alternative energy, alternative medicine, nuclear power, wind power, solar power, genetic engineering, MMR vaccines and autism, landfill, mercury fillings, nanotechnology, biotechnology, brain imaging. From the big questions to the little ones, paper or plastic. The answer, by the way, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, is plastic. Many people complain that these conflicts prove that science is dangerous and untrustworthy. I think that's nonsense. These conflicts are not inevitable. They're symptoms of a problem, namely, that we have failed as a society to institute procedures to manage information. Many years ago, the NBC newscaster John Chancellor remarked wistfully that he could recall the days when an argument was settled by invoking government statistics. Today, nobody's statistics can be trusted. Everything is twisted, spun, and hung out to dry. We have problems about the ownership of information, the accuracy of information, and the consequences of false information. In a broad historical sense, you could argue that this is merely what happens whenever there's a new product that society is making. Back in the days when we manufactured goods, we eventually recognized that quality was an important characteristic of manufactured things, and we evolved standards to measure quality and reliability of steel or rubber or automobiles. We had a way to gauge how good the product was, and we paid more for a better product, one that lasted longer, that had fewer defects. And eventually, we made manufacturers liable for products that failed. Today, our product is information. As many as half of American workers are knowledge workers. What they make, what they produce, is information. But we have not yet formalized mechanisms to gauge how good the information is. As a result, we have experienced many destructive episodes, killing adults, blighting children, wasting billions of dollars because of bad information. One of the first hints that our procedures for managing information were inadequate came about 40 years ago from the US Patent Office. For over a century, that office was dutifully issuing patents on things: mousetraps, cameras, gears, processors. Suddenly, with the rise of computers, they were asked to issue patents on how information was manipulated in a technology that was really all about information. It's generally agreed, in retrospect, that the Patent Office screwed up badly. Many inappropriate software patents were issued, and certainly the numbers were staggering. 20,000 software patents a year at one point. These days, software is written more or less in disregard of patents. It has to be. Government failed us. Genetics was the next technology to arrive at the Patent Office, and it decided that genes could be patented. This was a fundamental error, which looks more absurd as time goes on. Let's review for a minute just what is wrong with that decision. What's wrong with patenting genes? It's a little bit complicated, but I'll try and, talk slow. One thing I should tell you before I go any further is that everything that I'm going to say to you is from the standpoint of someone who is an intellectual property veteran. For 40 years, I've made my living from intellectual property, selling it, licensing it, litigating it. I've been to court several times. I always win. And by the way, it's not reported. 10 years ago, I spent a lovely month in St. Louis and going to court. And prior to the trial, the New York Times devoted 40 column inches because it was a really juicy story. Steven Spielberg and Michael Crichton had stolen this guy's script. When after a month-long trial, the jury took 45 minutes to return its verdict in our favor, the amount of time, the space the New York Times devoted to the story was 0. As a result, many people often come up to me with this sort of casual thing like, well, I know you've had a little legal problem. They don't know that I won. Anyway, I've lived through generations of change in intellectual property agreements caused by changing technology in my particular areas. When I began making movies, there were no videotapes, let alone DVDs. But what I'm trying to say is I viscerally understand that intellectual property creators need to protect their work and they need to make a profit. So everything that I'm about to say about gene patents has nothing to do with making a profit. And I want to tell you the single deep truth that I learned in my life about intellectual property is this: an intellectual property worker will take possession of everything they can get. They will take everything. It's just common sense. Of course, I will copyright Jurassic Park. But if I could copyright all dinosaur stories on an island, I'd do that. If I could copyright all dinosaur stories, I'd do that. If I could copyright all rampaging animal stories, I would. I'll take everything I can get. But as it turns out, my copyright protection is very narrowly limited to specific expression. After Jurassic Park, somebody made a game called Jurassic Island or Dino Island or something like that. I forget. There's nothing I could do about it. And this annoys me, but it's in the public interest because it means more products are available. And in fact, it's actually in my interest because it means that I can build on and revise ideas and themes that already exist in the work of others. There are dozens of medical TV shows out there, but I could still do ER. So it's my lifelong experience in intellectual property that leads me to see so clearly that gene patenting is against both public and private interests. Gene patenting breaks all sorts of long-standing rules about what is protectable, and it does so with absolutely no countervailing benefit. Let's go over some of this. Genes are facts of nature. Like gravity, sunlight, leaves on trees, wind, genes exist in the natural world. They can't be owned. You can own a test for a gene. You can own a drug that affects a gene, but you can't own the gene. You can own a treatment for a disease, but not the disease itself. Gene patents break that rule. Now, of course, you can argue about what's a fact of nature, and there are people who are paid to do that. But here's a simple test. If something existed millions of years before human beings even arrived on the planet, it's a fact of nature. It's not a human invention. It happened before people were here. If I can have a child, and it's in that child's body at birth, it's a fact of nature. So cut the sophistry and cut the legalisms. Genes are our common heritage. They're facts of nature. They're not human inventions, and they cannot be owned. Yet they are being owned. As a result, a gene patent is, in effect, an undeserved monopoly. The trouble arises because the patent is not for an invention, but for a fact of nature. Ordinarily, patent protection enables me to protect my invention, but encourages other people to make their own versions. Dino Island. My iPod doesn't keep you from making your own MP3 player. My patented mousetrap is made out of wood. Yours, made out of titanium, is also patentable. But this is not what happens with gene patents. The patent consists of pure information already existing in nature. Because there has been no invention, no one can innovate any other use of the patent without violating the patent itself. So further innovation is closed. This makes the patent an overbroad monopoly, and that's bad public policy. And from my point of view, that alone should be the end of the argument. A gene patent is, in effect, like granting a patent on noses. So even though we all have noses, somebody has the patent on noses, and what can that person who has the nose patent do? Well, they can stop spectacles because that relies on noses. They can stop all kinds of makeup because the makeup goes in the nose and they own the nose. They can probably sue chefs for making fragrant food because the fragrant food involves the use of the nose and they own the nose. That's as close as I can come to helping you understand the kind of roadblock that a gene patent represents. We also have plenty of evidence that they're very bad policy and that they hurt both patient care and suppress research. When Myriad patented 2 breast cancer genes, the so-called BRCA genes, they charged nearly $3,000 for the test, even though the cost of creating a gene test is nothing like the cost of creating a new drug. Actually, they did something else, or they're doing something else at the moment, which is that if you want to take the BRCA test, you have to agree to let your tissues be used for further testing. So in order to have the test, you have to agree to let this company use, in effect, your property for them to exploit it for ongoing testing. That's a very high price to pay because they own the patent. And it's not surprising that the European Patent Office thought enough of this and revoked their patent. The Canadian government announced that it would test without paying for the patent. Whenever you see this kind of high-level insurrection, governments refusing to do this, it means something is inherently and profoundly wrong. And something is wrong. Some years ago, the owner of the gene for Canavan disease refused to make the test widely available, even though families who had suffered with this disease, it's an inherited disease, had contributed money and tissues and had cooperated to get the gene identified so it wouldn't affect other people. Now they couldn't have the test that they had helped, in effect, create. Too bad for them. This is a mess, and it's a dangerous mess. When you hear that SARS, that's severe acute respiratory syndrome, remember from a few years back, when you hear that SARS research was inhibited by concerns over who owned the genome, with 3 simultaneous patent claims going on at once, and so researchers were hesitant, the research that was done wasn't vigorous, that's scary. We're talking about a contagious disease with a 10% death rate that spread to 24 countries around the world, and scientists wouldn't do the research because of patent fears? We have to be out of our minds to allow this to continue. At the moment, hepatitis C, HIV, Haemophilus influenza, various diabetes genes, and at least 40 other pathogens are privately owned. Somebody owns hepatitis C. Did you know that? You want to do research? You pay. You know what you pay? They make millions of dollars a year. Should somebody own a disease? They do. Nobody should own a disease. It's so ridiculous. I have trouble talking to you about it, but somebody has to talk about it. The last thing is we have to end gene patents because there's no other solution to the policy mess that they create. The AMA, for example, suggested some years ago, I think in 2001, that, well, okay, the patents exist, but the solution is to have them be made available at a modest license fee that doesn't interfere with research. Okay, well, that's full employment for lawyers. What's a modest license fee? Who's going to decide? Are we going to go to court to see if this fee or that fee is a modest fee? It's crazy. The patent shouldn't exist in the first place. Stop gene patents and move on. There's going to be screams because, as I said, the standard posture of anybody who works in IP is you take all you can get. If you have a monopoly, even though you know you shouldn't have it, you don't want to give it up, and you won't give it up happily. You're not going to smile and say, okay, fine, take it away. I knew I shouldn't have it. But the reality is, I think, that it's inhibiting research, and at least that's what the recent report of the National Academy of Sciences concluded, that so far gene patents had not gotten in the way of research, but they would. It was about to happen. And so we just have to stop it. And I think if we do, what will happen is instead of an inhibition of business, we're going to see an enormous flowering of new work and new discoveries and a new kind of freedom that researchers are going to feel. It's going to be a good thing. But meanwhile, going back to issues of science and information, meanwhile, the patent office continues to struggle. They recently issued a patent for pie charts generated by a computer. Prior art, as they say, goes back at least 20 or 30 years. They somehow didn't know. They also issued patents on how to sell a house, how to train using manuals. That's been patented. And other procedures that can hardly be considered unique. The method of making a dinosaur in Jurassic Park has been patented, not by me. I await a patent on the idea of using a light to find things in the dark. But if we stop being sarcastic and get serious, we realize that the Patent Office performs a very important function in a technological society, and it needs to be done much better. But that office, undermanned and underpaid, may not be the answer. I'm suggesting here that the government might not be up to the job. What then is the solution? I think in the 21st century, we're going to see more need for institutions that are very much more savvy about information. And if government can't provide them, as they were once unable to provide fast mail service, we're going to see non-governmental alternatives, as we have in FedEx. We're going to start to see something, a group of universities, a group of businesses, somebody's going to say, you know what, we can't do it this way. You know, we have to have some kind of an organization that will define what's patentable and what's not. I mentioned before that we tolerate enormous uncertainty about the reliability of information. Partly this is the inevitable effect of media, which has no interest in reporting how reliable information is. But not entirely. It's also the case that information changes. We often don't recognize how quickly it changes and how quickly it becomes outdated. For example, in the past year, we learned that low-fat diets don't reduce heart disease or lengthen life. Nor does maintaining a low body weight. Increased lifespan was actually associated with slight chubbiness. We learned that there are risks from hormones for menopausal women, that antioxidants do no good and may increase the risk of cancer. That vitamins confer no benefit and may themselves be risky, that high fiber does not protect against cancer, something we believed for 50 years. That mental exercise doesn't protect against Alzheimer's, that breast implants are okay after all, that Vioxx kills people, and drug rape is an urban myth. And it's also a myth that you need to put cheese in mouse traps. That only happens in cartoons. That's just in the last few months. Now, this is actually just the way science works. Things are always changing. As a result, according to some accounts, half of all scientific papers are wrong. I think that's probably an understatement. When I went to medical school, which was back in the dark ages, we were told, actually, interestingly, as we were graduating, we were told that a quarter of everything we had learned was already wrong. It would be interesting if they told us that in the first year instead of the last. Obviously, in the way that scientific papers are published and how information moves, obviously, peer review, a great tradition in science, has absolutely no effect. And the notion that peer review affects quality was demonstrated to be false about 50 years ago. Many, many studies later, it remains a ritualistic activity for scientists, what has been called the religion of peer review. According to Richard Smith, the former editor of the British Medical Journal, any belief in peer review is very unscientific. But you still hear people say, as the former vice president did once, that peer review is, quote, designed to ensure that errors and biases are detected and corrected before reaching the public. This is absolutely untrue. 50 years of studies confirm without the slightest doubt it is not true. A more accurate view is that of Drummond Rennie, who is the deputy editor of the journal The AMA and the organizer of the International Congress on Peer Review and Biomedical Publication, which has been held every 4 years since '86. Rennie says, there seems to be no study too fragmented, no hypothesis too trivial, no literature too biased or too egotistical, no design too warped, no methodology too bungled, no presentation of results too inaccurate, too obscure, and too contradictory, no analysis too self-serving, no argument too circular, no conclusion too trifling or too unjustified, and no grammar and syntax too offensive for a paper to end up in print. One important concern about peer review is the bias it introduces in terms of supporting conventional ideas and preventing new ideas. In an area like science, this is a very significant concern. And the number of Nobel Prize winners who in their acceptance speech have mentioned the fact that their research, the research for which they are winning the prize, couldn't originally be published is very large. And I, for one, am given pause when I read that the first report of the scanning electron microscope, which is a vital tool in modern science, when it was first submitted for publication, it was rejected. The author later won the Nobel Prize. So it does seem to suggest that peer review may be holding back fresh ideas and resisting the ongoing progress. And an interesting question is why, in a highly technological society, the scientific establishment has not thoroughly addressed this problem. It's a well-known problem. 50 years in science is a long time for something to continue to go on. But with so much flux you think that we would throw up our hands, we the public, and demand some measures of reliability, and there are actually many things that we might do. The first is that we might demand that any studies financed by taxpayer money have their data published online where anyone can check them. We, the people, have paid for this study. Scientists accepted our money. They don't have to. They can get their money someplace else. They accepted our money, but now they won't reveal their data to us, their employer, as they are required, in many instances, legally to do. In the normal world, they'd be fired on the spot. But beyond that, any scientist who doesn't make his data available for checking deserves the most harsh criticism from within the profession. I mean, let's cut the crap. Failure to show your data suggests fraud, or at least some kind of misleading behavior. If you haven't faked your results, publish and prove it. But the profession itself doesn't demand that standard. That's why scientists are perfectly calm in refusing to share their data. Phil Jones, one of the most important British climate scientists, was asked to show his work to someone else, and he responded, "Why should I make the data available to you when your aim is to try and find something wrong with it?" This statement, which sort of rocketed around the internet, was so startling that many scientists actually asked Jones if he had actually said that, and he said, yes, he did. The answer to him, of course, is that you make it available because you're a scientist. You're engaged in a search for objective truth, and you welcome attempts to find error because it is only through such independent verification that your work is really established as rock solid. Jones has a different philosophy. He doesn't need to show his work. He wants us to take his word for it. This is the same position as the Pope. And I actually have to question the indifference of the modern science establishment to these kinds of ex cathedra procedures, which many scientists in many areas are starting to do. Richard Feynman once said that the bedrock of science, it's interesting how he gets to the bottom of things. Feynman said the bedrock of science was the unwillingness to accept authority. Many scientists have forgotten that and have decided that they are the authority. Frederick Crews lists what he calls indicators of bad faith, and among them he includes indifference to the need of independent replication. In any case, evasion of this sort, not showing your work, is time-honored, and it'll continue until the scientific community, or more likely the government, requires it to stop. Whether you are the manufacturer of Vioxx or of the hockey stick, publish the data in full. Why are we even talking about this? You can't pass the 3rd grade without showing your work. Similarly, we should know clearly if a study has been replicated and independently verified or not. I personally favor color coding, green for verified, yellow for not verified, red for failed verification. But some methods such as this would keep the dust down on some of the more extreme claims, including the one that global warming was altering the thermohaline ocean circulation, leading to a European ice age. Last week's Science magazine reported it as, quote, false alarm, Atlantic conveyor belt hasn't slowed down at all. That's the premise of the movie Day After Tomorrow. So that's one climate movie shot to hell. We'll see if any others follow. Is there any way to stop the constant flood of argument in advance? Can we avoid the whole thing, all this turmoil? I would say we have several mechanisms. One I presented to the Senate last year. You let out multiple grants simultaneously. And you tell the researchers that their studies will be published together and that each research team will have access to the work of the other. And that comments will be published along with the original papers. If this were done, It would do a tremendous amount towards stopping a lot of the foolishness that we see in many areas of science that have to do with policy. And I was pleased that this idea was repeated in the US Climate Science Program publication, Synthesis and Assessment Product this year. Similarly, my claim that government needs to take charge of enforcing has been echoed by a famous climate scientist who said actual enforcement of the CCSP recommendations needs to be done by government funding agencies first and foremost. We do, at some time, need the government to step up. A second mechanism would be to require scientists to get it right the first time. In effect, this already happens. The very best researchers all do their own verification before they publish. Others, secure in the notion that nobody will ever check, will just publish sloppy work. But we might institute a grant system in which 30% higher grant fees were paid so long as your work was never overturned. Then you might have verification bounty hunters going around and checking other work in hopes of a reward. Unemployed graduate students who couldn't find work in laboratories. Now, I know this sounds strange, but if you think about it for a minute, most fields of human endeavor already have these bounty hunters. They're called lawyers. Color coding would also apply to government programs to tell us whether there is any effort at verification at all. Some of you may have seen that the GAO just published a critical commentary on programs to teach sexual abstinence. I could have told them the answer to this, but they didn't ask me. Studies of efficacy, according to the GAO, don't meet the most basic requirements, so we don't know if those programs work. A similar problem pertains to drug programs, both for prevention and treatment. To my knowledge, there are no good studies measuring the effectiveness of programs to teach kids to stay away from drugs or to help people get off drugs once they're hooked. No studies. A friend of mine who's very much involved in drug policy and has been for many decades brought together a colloquium of all the most important academics involved in this area. And she said, which drug treatment programs work? Silence at the table. If my son was on drugs, she said, which program would you recommend? Silence. Is anybody clear about this? Because I wasn't. Is anybody clear that actually there's no evidence, for example, that any preventive program in any area whatsoever, whether it's teaching kids not to get involved in drugs, having people use condoms, just, you name it, any preventive program designed to modify behavior in advance, there is no indication that such programs work in any field ever, and that none ever have. We spend, what, $600 million on these programs now? And the same with treatment. Now, another thing we could do is to get the media to highlight the extent of our lack of knowledge by emphasizing the limits that exist in any study, and all studies do have limits. This may seem impossible, but it's actually not. And if anybody's interested in this, I can tell you that how to institute a genetic algorithm to make the press report science better, which any large institution would be able to do. But the final change, and I think the ultimate solution to this problem, which is why it's a sort of temporary problem, but in the next 10 or 15 years, all of this is going to change. The final answer is that we're going to have liability for information. We already have areas where people are liable for the information that they provide. One example is marine charts. If you say a reef is in a certain place, it had better be there. Another is certain kinds of published data about financial markets. That, if you don't accurately report that, you can go to jail. Tax returns, Sarbanes-Oxley, and home sales where you're required to divulge what you know. These are all situations with serious penalties for error. We'll see more of this in the future. It's inevitable in an information society. Finally, it seems to me that the 21st century will be a time when we come to grips with the power of computer simulation. We might learn this from movies where Computers generate persuasive worlds that aren't real, worlds with dinosaurs, for example. But we don't. We think that our computer models represent reality, especially if we're the ones who built the models. Let's go back to England, which is where we began. In England today, not only politicians, but scientists are silent on an enormous scandal. The Crichton report on the unnecessary slaughter of millions of animals during the foot and mouth scare in the year 2001. Crichton found, quote, culling policy driven by unvalidated predictive models. And he says, the UK experience provides a salutary warning of how models can be abused in the interests of scientific opportunism. A similar concern may involve models in many other areas of science, ranging from epidemiology to climate to just almost anything you can name. In any case, sooner or later, we must, as a society, come to grips with these issues. And we will. And until we do, we're going to have more and more problems, large and small. I'm now 64 years old, and so I've seen a huge amount of fundamental scientific change in my lifetime. When I was a kid, everybody believed that the continents didn't move, that the human body had 48 chromosomes, that's what it said in the textbooks, that there was life on Mars, we just didn't get there yet, and that the climate was getting colder. Now, the continents do move. The human body has only 46 chromosomes. And the textbook pictures that showed 48, when you go back and look at them, you actually can't find 48. You can only find 46. There's no life on Mars, but we're still looking. And the climate is getting warmer. Will any of these ideas be revised in the next 50 years? I think it would be foolish to imagine that we know for sure. We don't know. But what's reliable is we think we do know. Again, Frederick Crews concluded rationality isn't an endowment, but an achievement that can be undone at any moment. And that is just why it is prudent to distrust sacrosanct authorities and to put one's faith instead in objective procedures that can place a check on our never-sated appetite for self-deception. But he adds, and I certainly agree with him here, several decades of untranquil experience in the public arena have led me to anticipate only limited success in getting this point across. Limited success or greater success, it remains a problem of great interest to me and an area of great concern. We will eventually solve it. Sooner is better than later. And at that, I think I'll stop there. I'd like to leave time to ask questions, and so thank you for your attention. I'll say it.
Time is short for the questions. I decided to pick a couple of the ones that were sort of quick and fun. One of these is, would you have any of your own DNA sequences determined, and if so, why? That was asked by Greg Lennon of Autism Pharmaceuticals.
I'm old. I don't care anymore. You know, it's
not something you've...
I think there might be a time when, and there may be a time when it's done routinely, and that's something that as a society we'll have to look at. One of the things we didn't touch on, but what we understand about many genes is that they don't tell you necessarily you have this in your future or you don't. There's a sort of a likelihood that you're given back. And there are a number of very thoughtful people who think that in the end we will not, that our interest in genes as predictive measures is a transitional thing that will eventually go away. And look at proteins or something else. But no, I'm not going to have my DNA done.
Okay. Here's a fun one. If a company owns a disease, couldn't the U.S. government charge them for the cleanup of the disease and all affiliated costs to society?
Isn't that a nice idea?
Yeah, I thought, there's a built-in safety.
No, they don't. They actually, I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit when I say they own the disease. They own the genome for the disease. Can't clean that up.
Not the same thing as owning a
Not
disease.
quite, no.
Okay. The good ones all come in at the end, so I was sitting here going through a couple.
Just far away.
Yeah. Do you use fiction to raise public consciousness because it's the best method or because you feel it's the forum that the informed layman will access? I sort of reworded that. The only forum available is the way it was worded. But
Well, one thing is I feel that, there ought to be some other form of fiction provided to the public besides that which comes from Congress.
that's good.
If I can be serious, it's hard. There are uses for fiction which have to do with making it easier for people sometimes to hear very unusual or unpalatable ideas. And that's the reason why I do it.
Last question. This person saw you at the Smithsonian discussing global warming. Have your opinions changed since then?
No. But something has happened, which is I can now tell when people ask me questions whether they're readers of Paul Krugman or whether something else. What's happened is that my views have been enormously misrepresented. So let me briefly go over it again. And I'm sure that most of the people who are critical of me haven't read my book. It's a lot easier to be critical of something when you don't know very much about it. There is global warming in the sense that the planet is getting warmer. There's no question about it. I'm only telling you what's in my book. There's no question about it. It's on the order of 0.5 degree or 0.6 of a degree in the last 100 years. Planet's getting warmer, weather's changing. It's very nice outside now. It's getting warmer. Carbon dioxide, a human product, is increasing. It's increased something like 30% last century. It is a greenhouse gas. The greenhouse effect is real, and we would expect the increase in carbon dioxide to cause an increase in temperatures. It would be very surprising if that change didn't have any effect. So the three elements are, it is getting warmer, human beings are increasing carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and it will create increased warmth. Having said that, which is what I believe, it does not answer the final question, which is the warming that we observe caused by the increase in carbon dioxide primarily? I don't think so. And I think it's certainly a part of it, but it's only a part of it. The debate over to what extent it is primarily or partially is an intense debate. And it has to do with climate sensitivity to carbon dioxide, which is ordinarily expressed as a figure of degrees centigrade in watts per meter squared. I was asked to attend a panel discussion at the New Yorker magazine this fall on this subject, and I thought, well, why would you have a panel discussion? It's a technical question. And the other people on the panel aren't going to understand even that that's the question. Another thing that I ordinarily say to audiences is I say, how many people here have read the third assessment report? How many people know what the third assessment report is? But you haven't read it. Okay, good. Don't read the summary because it's inaccurate. Third assessment report is a volume called Climate Change 2001, The Scientific Basis. It's the most recent, until next year when there's another one that comes out, it is the most recent statement of consensus issued by the UN IPCC, which is the is the collection of bureaucrats and scientists who put together a summary of the agreed upon views having to do with climate science. And my point is, nobody here's read it. And if you read it, it's pretty interesting. You can get it online, and it'll tell you exactly how people are thinking about stuff. And short of having that sort of detailed approach to it, you know, in other words, at the point where you hear, for example, how we make an estimation of the future is we make scenarios. What does this scenario consist of? Well, it consists of predictions about population, predictions about future technology to some degree, predictions about what the standard of living of future populations will be in the next 50, 100 years. Then they say, of course, we can't know any of that. We can't know what the population is going to be in 100 years. We can't know what the GDP per capita is going to be. So we make reasoned and careful and accurately put together scenarios. And my question is, how can it be reasonable and accurate if you don't know the answer to any of the questions? You know, I have another word for that. It's called a guess. But that's how it's done, and short of seeing those things, I think it's if all you do is read press reports, it's much easier to be persuaded that we face a catastrophe, and all I can tell you is, don't sell your snowshoes.
Thank you. And now, Michael Crichton, I'm going to offer you something. It's the one item that Ted Turner, Helen Thomas, Art Buchwald, and Angelina Jolie probably all see first thing when they pour their coffee in the morning. It's the coveted National Press Club coffee mug, and accept it with our warmest thanks for an exciting evening and for rolling with the questions. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Michael Crichton from the National Press Club. For more information, visit the author's website at michaelcrichton.net.